There is a walk in Newport, Rhode Island that runs along the edge of a cliff. It is called simply the Cliff Walk, a narrow public path cut into the rock face above the Atlantic, 3.5 miles of stone and salt air where the ocean crashes 40 feet below and the great summer estates of the Gilded Age rise to your left like a city from another world. You walk this path in the company of the wind and the gulls, and for much of it the view to your right is nothing but open water, gray and wide and indifferent, stretching toward a horizon that seems further away than horizons usually do. And then you reach Ochre Point, and there it is, 70 rooms, 13 oceanfront acres, 125,000 square feet of Indiana limestone, imported marble, gilded plaster, and bronze. A house that was never called a house. It was called, in the careful language of the Gilded Age, a summer cottage. The Breakers. Built between 1893 and 1895 at a cost of over $7 million, roughly $260 to $280 million in today's money, and occupied in a typical season for approximately 6 to 8 weeks each summer. 6 to 8 weeks, for one family. Stand at the iron gates on Ochre Point Avenue and you feel what the gates are designed to make you feel. Small. The entrance sequence was engineered for this effect, the scale calculated not for comfort but for impact, the message written in limestone before you have taken a single step inside. This was not a place a man built for himself. This was a place a man built for what he needed the world to believe about him. And to understand the house, you have to understand that distinction, and you have to understand the man. His name was Cornelius Vanderbilt II. He was born in 1843, the grandson of the original Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, who had built the New York Central Railroad from a ferry operation into the largest private railroad network in the country. The Commodore was a self-made man in the most unadorned sense of the phrase, rough-edged, contemptuous of convention, famously indelicate in both language and conduct. He built because he wanted to win. Legacy and elegance were secondary concerns. What the Commodore built, his son William Henry Vanderbilt inherited and expanded significantly. By the time William Henry died in 1885, the Vanderbilt fortune had grown into one of the largest private fortunes in the world. Cornelius Vanderbilt II inherited a substantial share of this, enough to sit on the board of the New York Central Railroad as its chairman, enough to maintain a brownstone on Fifth Avenue in New York and a summer place in Newport, enough to be, by any measure, among the most powerful men in American finance. And yet Cornelius II was not at peace with what he had. He was, in many of the accounts that survive him, a man of genuine seriousness, devout, disciplined, conscientious in ways his grandfather almost certainly was not. He worked hard. He gave to charity. He worried about the moral weight of his fortune in a way the Commodore simply did not. But underneath that seriousness ran a deep and restless anxiety specific to his position. He was the heir of a dynasty built by someone else, measured always against men who had made something rather than received it, operating in a social world where railroad fortunes were still faintly regarded as new money. Powerful, yes, but not quite settled. He needed to be legitimate. He needed to be unquestionable. He needed a house that made the argument for him in stone so he would not have to keep making it himself. In 1885, he purchased the existing property on Ochre Point Avenue, a Queen Anne-style wooden mansion originally built for tobacco magnate Pierre Lorillard IV in 1878, for approximately $450,000, then spent an additional reported $500,000 on improvements. He renovated it. He enlarged it. He made it suitable. It was not enough. On November 25, 1892, the original wooden breakers burned to the ground. There are no surviving accounts of exactly what Cornelius II felt, standing before the ruins. But we know what he did. Within months, he had commissioned architect Richard Morris Hunt to design not a replacement, but a transformation, not a house, a statement. The requirements were essentially these: it must be larger, it must be more impressive, and it must not, under any circumstances, burn down again. Richard Morris Hunt was the right man for this moment. The first American to study architecture at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, Hunt had spent his career translating European palatial idioms into the language of American ambition. He understood exactly what Cornelius II needed. He chose Italian Renaissance, the great palazzo tradition of 16th-century northern Italy, the architecture of merchant dynasties in Genoa and Brescia who had converted trade fortunes into stone legacies that outlasted the men who built them. It was a precise and intelligent choice. It said, "We are not performing wealth, we are inhabiting it." Construction began in 1893, carried out by several hundred tradesmen and laborers over the course of approximately 2 years. By 1895, the house was finished. 70 rooms, 5 principal levels, a separate underground boiler plant connected to the main house by a service tunnel, an exterior of Indiana limestone over a fireproof frame of steel and masonry, interiors lined with marble from Italy and Africa, gilded plasterwork, mosaic floors, and bronze throughout. It opened for the summer season of 1895. Stand at those iron gates again. Think about what it took to build what is on the other side of them. And then notice that the gates are still here, and that Cornelius Vanderbilt II, who built all of this to prove something, died in 1899, having lived in the finished house for only 4 summer seasons. What he was trying to say with this building outlasted him by more than a century. Whether the building answered the question he was asking is something we will spend the rest of this documentary quietly exploring. The fire gave him permission, not because the loss of the original breakers was a financial catastrophe. Cornelius Vanderbilt II had the resources to rebuild without meaningful strain, but because the original house had always been someone else's vision, purchased and improved, but never entirely his own. It had been built in 1878 for tobacco magnate Pierre Lorillard IV, bought by the Vanderbilts in 1885, renovated and enlarged over the following years. It was inherited territory. The fire cleared it. What rose in its place would be built from the ground up to his own specifications, with no prior occupant's decisions to work around. He gave the commission to Richard Morris Hunt in 1892, within months of the ruins cooling. Hunt was the right man for this particular moment in American architecture. He had been the first American to study at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, and he had spent his career translating the vocabulary of European palatial design into the language of American ambition. A translation that required not just technical knowledge, but a specific understanding of what newly moneyed American families needed a building to say on their behalf. He had designed for the Vanderbilt family before. He understood the brief before it was fully spoken. The style he chose was Neo-Italian Renaissance, specifically the great palazzo tradition of 16th-century northern Italy, the architecture of the merchant aristocracies of Genoa and Brescia who had converted trade fortunes into buildings designed to outlast their own lifetimes. The choice was deliberate and intelligent. It carried a precise message. This was not the imitation of a royal court, which would have read as pretension. This was the architecture of serious men who had made serious money and intended to remain. The rusticated limestone base, the symmetrical facades, the sculptural masks of Apollo and Mercury above the exterior, reliefs celebrating progress in art, science, and commerce, all of it argued that Vanderbilt wealth was continuous with civilization itself, not merely adjacent to it. Construction began in 1893. The workforce, as documented, consisted of several hundred tradesmen and laborers, carpenters, stonemasons, ironworkers, plasterers, mosaic setters, and general laborers, working through a compressed timeline to meet the social deadline of the 1895 Newport season. The fireproofing requirement shaped every structural decision. The 1892 fire had destroyed a wooden house. The replacement would contain no structural wood anywhere in the building. The frame was steel trusses and masonry. The exterior cladding was Indiana limestone over brick. Interior floors throughout were marble, tile, terrazzo, and mosaic, materials that would not burn. Interior partitions were largely masonry. Even the decorative ceilings were plaster, metal, or stone rather than timber. The boilers presented a separate and significant engineering problem. A house of 70 rooms required enormous heating capacity, and in any conventional design the boiler plant would have sat in the basement. But boilers were fire risks, exactly the kind of risk that had leveled the original breakers. Hunt's solution was to remove them from the building entirely. A dedicated underground heating facility was constructed beneath the caretaker's cottage, approximately 120 yards from the main house, connected to it by a wide service tunnel capable of storing several hundred tons of coal and carrying heating pipes, electrical conduits, and supply lines. The coal arrived by its own entrance, was handled by its own workers, and burned in its own contained space, entirely out of sight and out of range of the main house. The interiors were designed by Jules Allard and Sons of Paris, one of the leading decorating firms of the era, with additional work by Boston designer Ogden Codman Jr. The materials they specified were, by definition, the finest available: marbles imported from Italy and Africa, rare woods, gilded plasterwork executed by craftsmen brought from Europe, bronze hardware and fittings throughout, mosaic panels. The decorative program alone, the carved paneling, the murals, the custom bronze work, represented months of skilled labor at rates that reflected the scarcity of the craftsmen capable of producing it. The finished building covered approximately 125,000 square feet across 5 principal levels, with roughly 62,000 square feet of actual living space and 33 rooms designated as staff bedrooms. It was equipped with an Otis elevator, originally hydraulic, powered by water stored in cisterns on the upper floors. The electrical system, rewired by the early 1930s, eventually fed more than 350 circuits from a large marble and copper switchboard in the basement. The major chandeliers were designed to burn both gas and electricity, a practical hedge against the unreliability of early electrical service, and a detail that captures the particular moment of technological transition in which the house was built. The total cost came to over $7 million in 1895 currency. In today's terms, that figure sits at roughly $260 to $280 million, depending on how the calculation is made. It is worth being precise about what this number includes: the structure, the decorative programs, the furnishings, and the full fit-out. It does not include the $450,000 paid for the original Lorillard property in 1885, nor the reported $500,000 spent on that property before the fire. The construction workers who built it were paid wages consistent with the skilled and unskilled labor markets of the 1890s. Their names are not in the public record. The house they produced opened for the summer season of 1895, was immediately recognized as the largest and most opulent Newport cottage, and has stood without structural failure for over 130 years. The men who built it went home when the job was done. The building remained, and it still remains, which was exactly what it was designed to do. The Breakers is 2 houses. This is the fact that most visitors do not fully register on their first walk through the front door. They see the Great Hall, 50 feet wide, 50 feet long, 50 feet high, a perfect cube of marble and stone open through 2 full stories, the walls lined with Caen stone imported from France, the floor a composition of marble and mosaic that took months to lay. They see the scale, the light from the ocean-facing loggia, the sense of a room designed to stop thought for a moment and replace it with something simpler, the wordless recognition of power arranged in space. What they do not see, because it was designed not to be seen, is the other house running alongside and beneath the first one. The hidden house has its own staircases, narrow, steep, enclosed within walls or tucked behind panels, difficult with a loaded tray but private enough that a maid or footman could move between floors without appearing in any corridor a guest would use. It has its own dining hall in the basement, its own bedroom floor on the 3rd story and attic, where 30 staff members slept in rooms of approximately 10 by 12 feet, furnished with a narrow bed, a dresser, and a washstand. None of the marble, none of the gilded plaster, none of the imported fabric that characterized every surface below. The 2 houses share walls, share air, share a roof. They do not share a world. Richard Morris Hunt designed the building around this division as its central organizing principle. The layout was zoned with precision across 5 levels, and understanding those levels means understanding exactly what the house was built to do. The basement was the engine room. The main kitchen sat here, directly below the dining room, connected to it by a dumbwaiter system that moved prepared dishes upward and returned dirty china downward without a single plate crossing a public threshold. Adjacent to the kitchen were the baking pantry, the servants' dining hall, the laundry, and a series of storage rooms. Further still, the service tunnel ran underground for 120 yards to the boiler plant, bringing heat and utilities through the building's hidden circulatory system. Deliveries of coal and provisions arrived through separate service entrances, handled by workers who would never appear in the rooms above. The first floor was the performance floor, the ceremonial level, as the house's own internal logic classified it. The entrance foyer opened into the Great Hall, that 50-foot cube which functioned as the house's primary statement of intent. From there, a carefully considered sequence of rooms extended outward: the gentleman's reception room, the ladies' reception room, the music room, the billiard room, the morning room, and the loggias facing the Atlantic. Every room on this floor was designed to be seen, to be inhabited by guests, to contribute to the impression of a household operating at the absolute peak of what private life could achieve in 1895 America. Between the first and second floors sat the mezzanine, an entresol tucked near the kitchen zone, housing bedrooms for the butler, the chef, and visiting valets. Key senior staff kept close to operations but entirely out of the guest circulation. The second floor held the family's private rooms, bedrooms, sitting rooms, and more intimate spaces, including Alice Vanderbilt's oval bedroom, which came equipped with multiple closets, dedicated servant access points so her lady's maid could enter and assist without crossing through Cornelius's rooms, and an in-room pager system connecting directly to the staff network below. The third floor and attic were where the arithmetic of the house became most revealing. In the north wing, Hunt used the height of the building's Italianate envelope to stack 2 layers of servant rooms within what appeared from outside to be a single floor, fitting approximately 30 staff bedrooms into that space alone while maintaining the palazzo roofline that the exterior required. Above that, the attic held additional servant quarters and large cisterns storing both fresh water and salt water, as well as the hydraulic reservoir that originally powered the Otis elevator. The movement systems connecting all of this were the house's invisible nervous system, the annunciator panel in the butler's pantry connected by wire to pull bells in every principal room. A guest rang, a number lit, a footman was dispatched. Dumbwaiters ran between the kitchen, pantry, and storage levels, handling the constant vertical traffic of food, china, and supplies that a house of this scale required throughout the day and evening. The Otis elevator ran from basement to attic, originally hydraulic, later electrified, used by the family and senior guests, not by the staff who used the back stairs. The staff used the back stairs always. This was not incidental. The narrow service staircases enclosed within the walls were not a cost-saving measure. The house cost over $7 million. Cost was not the constraint. They were an architectural decision about what should be visible and what should not, about whose movement through the building constituted a presence and whose constituted a function. This is what the floor plan reveals when you read it carefully. The more beautiful the room, the more invisible labor it required to maintain it. The great hall needed to be polished. The dining room table needed to be set and cleared. The family's clothes needed to be pressed and laid out and put away. The fires needed to be lit before the family came downstairs and extinguished after they retired. All of it was done by people moving through the other house, the narrow, steep, 10 by 12-foot house that ran parallel to the marble one and made it possible. 2 houses, 1 building. One was designed to be remembered. The other one was designed to disappear. Newport in July was a performance with a fixed cast and a very precise set of rules. The families arrived from New York and Boston in late June, luggage preceding them by several days in separate consignments, and the season ran through August, a narrow corridor of weeks during which the real business of the American plutocracy was conducted in the language of dinner invitations and afternoon calls. Who was invited, and to which house, and to sit where at the table, and whether the hostess received you warmly or with the particular coolness that communicated, without a single word being spoken, that your standing had slipped. These were not frivolous concerns. They were the social infrastructure through which marriages were arranged, business alliances were consolidated, and the boundaries of acceptable American wealth were drawn and redrawn each summer. The Breakers was the most powerful address in this system, not because it was necessarily the most beautiful house in Newport, though the argument could be made, but because of what it represented. Cornelius Vanderbilt II sat as chairman of the New York Central Railroad, one of the most powerful corporate entities in the country. His wife Alice Gwynne Vanderbilt, born in 1845 into a respectable but not enormously wealthy New York family, had married into the Vanderbilt fortune and become one of the most formidable social operators of her generation, not flamboyant, not theatrical, but precise, controlled, and absolutely clear about what the family's position required and what it could not afford to concede. An invitation to the Breakers was not an invitation to a party, it was a statement about you. The guest list at a house like this drew from what was known as New York's 400, the elite social list that defined who belonged to acceptable society, alongside visiting European aristocrats, industrial magnates, and occasionally political figures and artists considered socially suitable. Attendance at dinners, balls, and weekend house parties signaled one's standing, and invitations were themselves instruments of precise inclusion and exclusion. Alice Vanderbilt could reward loyalty or signal displeasure simply by deciding who saw the great hall lit and filled with music. The rituals of a Newport season were carefully layered. Mornings were relatively private, family and house guests at breakfast, correspondence, the social labor of planning the day's obligations. Afternoons brought the cliff walk or the ocean drive, a ceremonial procession of carriages in which being seen was itself the point. Tea on the loggia overlooking the Atlantic, the ocean backdrop, the white linens, the seamless appearance of refreshments that had required hours of preparation below, provided the setting for more intimate conversations that a formal dinner table, with its demands of protocol, could not accommodate. Then, evenings. The dining room at the Breakers seated 40 guests at a formal dinner. A multi-course meal here was not a meal. It was a demonstration. The elaborate table settings watched over by the butler and footman, the sequence of dishes timed to the minute, the silver and crystal arranged with the precision of a theater set. Conversation itself followed understood rules. Who spoke to whom, in what order, on what subjects? A social misstep at this table could reverberate through business and marital networks in ways that outlasted the evening by months. The house also served as a stage for family milestones, introductions of debutante daughters, receptions for newly married couples, and gatherings that link the Vanderbilt name to European aristocratic families through carefully arranged connections. Gladys Vanderbilt, the youngest daughter of Cornelius II and Alice, would eventually marry Count Laszlo Széchenyi of Hungary in 1908, one of a pattern of alliances between American industrial fortunes and European nobility that the Newport social season actively facilitated. The Vanderbilts had a particular stake in what was being demonstrated through all of this. The family fortune was, by the standards of Newport's most established money, relatively recent. The Commodore had been a working ferry operator within living memory of some who sat at that table. The house, the season, the elaborate machinery of the entertainments, all of it served in part to argue that the Vanderbilts had moved beyond their origins, that the fortune had acquired the weight of something permanent. Alice Vanderbilt understood this project precisely. Where her sister-in-law Alva, wife of Cornelius's brother William K., had pursued social position with an aggressive energy that generated as much controversy as admiration, Alice operated through impeccable discretion. She did not force doors. She made it clear, through the quality of her entertainments and the caliber of her guest list, that those doors were hers to open or close as she chose. The house did much of the rhetorical work without anyone needing to say a word. Guests who passed through the iron gates, approached through the entrance forecourt, and stepped into the great hall were confronted immediately with a room 50 feet in every dimension, decorated with allegorical figures representing science, art, literature, and commerce, a claim, carved in stone, that Vanderbilt wealth was continuous with human civilization itself. But behind every evening that made this argument, a specific machinery was running. 30 to 40 servants produced the effortless impression. In the kitchen below the dining room, the chef and kitchen staff, who had risen around 5:30 in the morning, were in the final hours of preparation for a dinner that might involve multiple courses and required precision timing across every dish. The butler was coordinating footmen who had spent part of the day polishing silver and pressing linen. Upstairs, ladies' maids were assisting guests with the elaborate process of dressing for dinner. Every detail had been planned by Alice and executed by the housekeeper through the hours before the first guest arrived. What the guests saw was a room filled with flowers, candlelight, and conversation. What the house contained in those same hours was a controlled operation of considerable complexity, running on labor that started before dawn and continued well past midnight, on wages that, for a chambermaid, amounted to perhaps $18 to $25 a month with room and board included. Contemporary accounts note the intense social pressure, the rigid codes of dress and behavior, the knowledge that the Newport season was, beneath its apparent ease, both playground and battleground for the American plutocracy. The Breakers was the most visible arena of that competition. The performance required an audience that agreed, as a condition of attendance, not to look too closely at how it was produced. Newport society in the summer seasons of the 1890s was very practiced at that agreement. In the summer of 1895, the Breakers opened for its first season. Cornelius Vanderbilt II was 51 years old. He had spent the better part of 3 years overseeing the construction of a house that was, by every measure, complete. 70 rooms, 13 oceanfront acres, a fireproof palazzo of Indiana limestone that would not burn, would not fade, would not yield to any of the accidents that had destroyed the first breakers and threatened, in quieter ways, the social position the building was meant to secure. He had built the argument in stone. He had won. He had a few summers left. The stroke came, and then, in 1899, he was gone. The research on this period is precise about the facts and quiet about everything else. Cornelius Vanderbilt II suffered a stroke and died in 1899, having used the house for only a few summers. The timeline is short enough to be uncomfortable. The house was finished in 1895. He was dead 4 years later. The structure he had commissioned to communicate permanence and invulnerability had outlasted the man who needed it before he had properly lived in it. There is a particular kind of grief in this that the house itself does not record. The rooms look the same now as they did in 1895. The Great Hall is still 50 feet in every dimension. The dining room ceiling is still vaulted above where the table stood. The loggia still faces the Atlantic. Nothing in the architecture marks the fact that the man who commissioned all of it spent more time building it than inhabiting it, that the most elaborate private house in Newport was used by its owner for a handful of summers before the body that had driven its construction gave out. The research document that frames the breaker's story identifies this directly as one of its central ironies. The builder enjoys his palace for only a few years, while the structure outlives him by more than a century. It is a short sentence for what it contains. A man builds something designed to last forever. It lasts. He does not. What followed 1899 was Alice. Alice Gwynne Vanderbilt, born in 1845, was 54 years old when her husband died. She would live until 1934, another 35 years, and for much of that time the breakers remained her instrument. Through the 1900s and into the 1910s, she continued to preside over the house as a summer matriarch, using it for balls, dinners, and the social rituals that had always been the building's primary function. The season continued. The entertainments continued. The careful management of who was invited and what the invitation communicated continued. But the project had shifted in a way that no amount of social precision could entirely conceal. The breakers had been built as a monument to Cornelius II, to his position, his permanence, his claim on a specific kind of American legitimacy. Without him, it became something different. A stage on which Alice performed the continuation of something that was, in fact, slowly contracting. The house itself had not changed. The world around it was beginning to. The fortune that had paid for the marble and the limestone was spreading across generations and trusts in the way that large fortunes do, diffusing its concentration across more and more hands. The labor market that had supplied the 30 to 40 servants who made the house function was beginning, quietly, to strain against the assumptions built into the architecture. The building was designed to project that nothing could touch it. The years after 1899 were the years in which the things that could touch it began, one by one, to arrive. Alice's long occupation of the breakers after Cornelius's death carries its own particular quality. She was a woman of formidable discipline and social intelligence, and she applied both to maintaining the house as a going concern. But there is a difference between a house built by a man to make an argument about himself and that same house managed by the woman who outlived him. The argument had been his, the maintenance of it became hers. For 35 years she kept the rooms in order, the seasons running, the gates properly attended. She died in 1934, at 89. By then the world that had made the house possible, the world of Newport seasons and railroad fortunes and 30 servants working 18-hour days so that 40 guests could dine without visible effort, was already becoming historical. The Great Depression had arrived. The social grammar of the Gilded Age had come to seem not merely old-fashioned, but actively strange. The house stood on its 13 acres above the Atlantic, still structurally sound, fireproof as designed, maintained as well as the dwindling resources of a dispersing fortune allowed. The building that Cornelius II had built to outlast everything was outlasting everything, including the conditions that had made it make sense. What would happen to it next was a question the house could not answer for itself. It was built to stand, and it was standing. Whether standing was enough, whether the argument it had been built to make could survive being made in a world that no longer shared the assumptions behind it, was a different kind of question entirely. The Atlantic outside the loggia had no opinion on the matter. It simply continued, as it always had, to arrive and withdraw against the cliff below the house that was built to last forever. The world that made the breakers possible did not end dramatically. It did not end with a crash or a fire or a single decisive moment that could be named. It ended the way most things end, gradually, through the accumulation of small changes that were individually manageable and collectively transformative, until the model that had produced 70 rooms of marble and limestone on a Rhode Island cliff was simply no longer viable, and the question was not how to sustain it but how to let it go with enough dignity that the loss did not look like what it was. The pressures arrived from several directions at once. The introduction of federal income taxes in the early 20th century and the estate taxes that followed began placing a slow but irreversible claim on exactly the kind of concentrated inherited wealth that had produced the breakers. The Vanderbilt fortune had been built and maintained in an era when immense private wealth could accumulate across generations with relatively limited public obligation. That era was ending. What the new tax structures introduced was not immediate ruin but a steady arithmetic pressure, each generation inheriting a little less, maintaining the same fixed costs on a diminishing base until the gap between what the house required and what the family could provide became impossible to close by ordinary means. The labor question pressed from a different direction. The 30 to 40 servants who had made the breakers function in its peak seasons had come from a specific labor market, one in which domestic service was, for many working-class women and recent immigrants, among the more stable forms of employment available. Room, board, and wages in exchange for long hours and constrained freedom. That market was changing. Alternative employment was expanding. Industrial work, office work, retail, the options available to the people who had previously filled the servant corridors of Newport's great houses were multiplying through the early decades of the 20th century. The houses built around the assumption of a deep, cheap, compliant labor supply were finding that supply contracting. The invisible labor the architecture had been designed to make invisible was becoming, in economic terms, increasingly expensive. Then came the Depression, and then the war. In January 1943, the breakers was used as a civilian air raid drill site. More than 500 wardens and volunteers used its basements as part of a civil defense exercise. The kitchens and storage rooms and service corridors that had been built to support a Gilded Age social season were repurposed for one wartime exercise as emergency infrastructure for a democratic republic at war. It was a small event in the history of the building, and it went unrecorded in any dramatic way. But it was its own kind of statement about how thoroughly the world had reorganized itself around different assumptions. The last figure of the Vanderbilt era at the breakers was Gladys. Gladys Vanderbilt had been born in the house in 1886, the youngest child of Cornelius II and Alice. She had grown up moving through those 50-foot halls and those 10 by 12 servant rooms with equal familiarity, the child of the family that owned the building, shaped by it in the particular way that houses shape the children raised within them. In 1908, she had married Count Laszlo Széchenyi of Hungary, becoming Countess Széchenyi, linking the American railroad fortune to European aristocracy in the manner the Newport social season had always facilitated. By the 1940s, she faced a situation that had no good solutions, only less bad ones. The breakers was too large to maintain privately, too expensive to run, and too historically significant, too publicly identified with the Vanderbilt name and with Newport's place in American cultural memory, to sell quietly or allowed to deteriorate. It required, by one documented account, over $16,000 annually in property taxes alone in the mid-1960s, on top of insurance costs and major structural repairs. The maintenance of a 125,000 square foot limestone palazzo on 13 oceanfront acres was, in the labor and tax environment of mid-20th century America, a problem with no private solution. On June 10, 1948, it was announced that the breakers would be leased to the Preservation Society of Newport County for $1 per year. The ground floor staterooms would open to paying visitors beginning July 1st. Gladys would retain a private apartment on the upper floors. She would continue to cover property taxes, insurance, and major structural repairs. The Preservation Society would take responsibility for operational wages and day-to-day maintenance of the public areas. $1 per year for a house that had cost over $7 million to build. The arrangement Gladys created in 1948 was a hybrid that acknowledged, without quite stating what had actually happened, that private Vanderbilt life at this scale was no longer viable and that the alternative to opening the house was losing it. What she preserved was the shell, the rooms, the furnishings, the architectural envelope that Cornelius II had commissioned and Richard Morris Hunt had designed. What she gave up was the fiction that the building was still functioning as it had been built to function. For the next 17 years, tourists filed through the staterooms below while Gladys lived in her apartment above. Visitors paid to see the Great Hall and the dining room and the morning room as historical exhibits, while overhead, a Vanderbilt moved through the practical daily business of life in what remained of her family's world. The strangeness of this arrangement, a house simultaneously private home and public museum, the same rooms serving memory and admission fees, was its own kind of architectural statement about what the Gilded Age had become by 1948. Gladys died in 1965. Under her will, her heirs were given the option to retain or disclaim the property. They disclaimed it. On December 28, 1972, the Preservation Society of Newport County formally purchased the breakers and approximately 90% of its original furnishings from Gladys's heirs for $365,000, about $2.8 million in today's terms. By the time of the purchase, more than 1.5 million people had already toured the house since 1948. The building had been visited by more people as a museum than had ever entered it as a private home. The story did not end there. In the 2000s and into the 2010s, rising visitor numbers, hundreds of thousands annually, strained the site's infrastructure and prompted the Preservation Society to propose a permanent welcome center on the grounds. The response from some neighbors, donors, and Vanderbilt descendants was immediate and pointed. Opponents, including designer Gloria Vanderbilt, argued that inserting a contemporary structure would despoil the historic landscape and fill the approach to the house with what critics characterized as commercial clutter. The National Park Service expressed concern that the project might damage the landmark's character. Lawsuits from neighborhood associations delayed approvals through 2014 and 2015. Courts eventually sided with the society's zoning permissions. The Welcome Center was completed, and the Vanderbilt descendants, who had maintained a private apartment in the upper floors through the museum era, moved out around 2018, ending more than 70 years of intermittent family residency. The house Cornelius II built to communicate permanence had survived by becoming something he would not have recognized: a publicly ticketed attraction managed by an institution, its private apartments vacated, its grounds adjusted to accommodate the needs of hundreds of thousands of annual visitors who came not as guests but as paying members of the general public. It was still standing. The limestone was intact. The marble floors were still polished. The gates, which had been built to keep the world at a careful distance, were open. The iron gates are still there. They stand on Ochre Point Avenue exactly where they stood in 1895, the same gates that were designed to communicate, before a single word was spoken, before a single step was taken, that this was a threshold not everyone was entitled to cross. They are open now most days to anyone who has purchased a ticket. Roughly 400,000 people pass through them every year, making the breakers one of Rhode Island's most significant tourist draws. This is the final irony of the building, and it is a quiet one. The house was built as the most precise possible instrument of exclusion, a place whose entire architecture, from the great iron gates to the hidden servant corridors, was engineered around the question of who belonged and who did not, who was invited and who remained outside, whose presence was celebrated and whose was designed to be invisible. It has survived by becoming the opposite, a place where the general public files through in organized groups, audio guide in hand, looking at the rooms where the Vanderbilts once performed their careful theater of legitimacy. The Preservation Society of Newport County has operated the house since 1948 and owned it outright since 1972. In the decades since, it has gradually expanded what the visit includes. The primary tour still moves through the great public rooms of the first floor, the Great Hall, the dining room, the morning room, the loggia with its Atlantic view, and these rooms remain exactly what they were designed to be: overwhelming. The 50-foot cube of the Great Hall still does what Richard Morris Hunt intended it to do, which is to make the person standing beneath it feel, for a moment, the particular wordlessness of encountering something built to a different set of assumptions about what human beings are entitled to occupy. But there are now tours of the third floor, tours of the servant quarters, the 10 by 12 rooms where the staff slept, the narrow back staircases, the basement kitchen complex where the real machinery of the house operated through those long summer days and late evenings. The Preservation Society has been building slowly a more complete picture, acknowledging with increasing directness that the story of the breakers is not only the story of the family whose name is on the gate, it is also the story of the people who made the gate worth having. That story remains incomplete. The names of most of the servants who worked here are not in any document the public can easily access. The precise wages, the exact hours, the specific daily experience of the women who polish those marble floors, these things exist in the historical record only in outline, reconstructed from comparable estates and general labor patterns rather than from the breakers' own records. The architecture was preserved with extraordinary care. The lives it depended on were preserved the way such lives usually are, imperfectly, in fragments, in the gaps between the things that were considered worth writing down. This is the central contradiction the building has carried for over a century. It was designed to make labor invisible, and it succeeded so completely that even now, when we actively look for the people who kept it running, we find only approximate numbers and general conditions and the occasional trace of a named individual in a secondary account. The house preserved its own surfaces beautifully. The human system underneath it left fewer marks. Outside, the cliff walk is still public. It has been public since before the Vanderbilts arrived, and it will be public long after the last debate about welcome centers and visitor numbers and the ethics of heritage tourism has run its course. You can walk the path today and look up at the limestone façade from the cliff below, the same view the construction workers had when they stepped back to assess what they were building, the same view the servants had returning from an afternoon off. The house looks the same from the cliff as it always did. Permanent, settled, built to outlast everything. What it has outlasted in the end is the entire world that produced it. The railroad monopolies that generated the fortune, the labor market that supplied the staff, the social grammar of the Newport season, the specific anxiety of new money trying to become old enough to stop being anxious. That world is gone. The house is still here, and it receives more visitors in a single season now than it received guests across its entire private history. Cornelius Vanderbilt II built it to make an argument about permanence and power and the right to occupy a specific position in the American order. He had a few summers in it. The argument in limestone has now been standing for over 130 years. Long past the point where anyone who heard the original argument is still alive to confirm or dispute what was meant. What the house says now is something slightly different from what it was built to say. It says that the things we construct to prove we are permanent have a way of outlasting not only us, but the very conditions that made the construction feel necessary. It says that beauty and exploitation are not opposites, that they can inhabit the same building at the same time, one visible, one hidden, both real. It says that the questions a place raises do not expire when the people who built it do. The gates are open. The Atlantic is unchanged. The house is still standing. What you hear when you stand in that great hall, in that 50-foot cube of marble and stone, with the ocean light coming through the loggia and the weight of all those rooms above you, is entirely your own.